am reading A Lot to Remember. This book was published in 1962. It's by Joan Marshall Grant, and it is about her travels through this part of France. It has a lovely little dedication in here where she says to Denys and Charles, with love, for a lot to remember. They were both her husbands. She was born in 1907 and passed away in 1989, and she used to write books about her far memories. 7 books, in fact, about ancient Egypt, about Italy in the 16th century, and so on. And I'm fascinated by her. This here is chapter 8. It is a journey book, largely, and she explains more about the history of these places. Chapter 8, QUATORZE JUILLET. When Charles and I spent a month at Saint-Céré, we ate and slept at the Drude Doré, to the sound of rushing water. But when Denys and I went there, the Brave, a tributary of the Dordogne, was staggered behind its wares. The hotel was under new management, and I was unable to introduce him either to Monsieur and Madame Caborio or the trout they used to gild with butter. So I will bypass these disappointments and go back to an earlier memory of the 14 Juillet 1956. The weir by the Truc Doré marks the western boundary of the water in which angling is permitted only for 1 hour in the year. Just as the red deer of Scotland know the limit of their sanctuaries, so do the fish of Saint-Céré know theirs. There is no trout amongst them, for these have been driven away by their coarser brethren, carp and pike, who jostle for the swill cast from kitchen windows or tipped from buckets of a bridge. Very fat do the fish grow, and only those who have also grown foolish drift over their weir, where anglers stand in wait with the patience of frontier guards. But on Bastille Day, the 14th of July, the fish of Saint-Céré have their placid routine rudely interrupted, and are probably as startled as were the 5 prisoners of the Bastille in 1789 when the crowd broke in. Early in the morning, the parapet of the road beside the fish sanctuary and the 5 bridges which span it are divided by chalk marks into spaces 2 meters wide and neatly numbered. To each space an angler is allotted, and as some positions are far more favorable than others, these positions are decided by ballot. By 2:30 p.m. about 100 anglers had assembled in the Place de la République. So had the town band, various notables and officials, and a large number of spectators. I was surprised to see that several women and 3 children were competing, for at no other time did I see fisherwomen in the lot. No doubt they considered the substantial money prizes, one for the largest and one for the smallest fish, made this event a worthwhile instead of a time-wasting occupation. Everyone seemed unusually solemn, probably because it was raining. The anglers formed themselves into procession and, led by the band now in full blast, marched through the town with rods at the slope. After officials had made sure that the ticket pinned on each angler matched the number of the space in which he stood, the off was given by 3 shots from a revolver. Like a 100-thonged flail, the rods swished down, but, which seemed almost incredible, none of the lines became entangled. Knowing how tame and greedy were the fish, I expected action. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. The rain became heavier, until the drops bouncing on the surface must have caused all but the most feckless fish to shelter under the bridges. Spectators, looking rather guilty for deserting, began first to drift, then to scurry away. I was among them, glad that in France it is considered unmannerly, if not actually insane, unnecessarily to defy the weather. But the anglers stayed at their posts, drenched but determined, until released at the end of their 60 minutes by a single revolver shot. Both prizes were won, so their fortitude must have been rewarded by at least 2 fish. But I did not see either of them, for by then my clothes were hanging up to dry, and I was peacefully reading in a hot bath. That evening, after the rain had stopped, I again found myself a spectator in the Place de la République, and this time a most reluctant one, for we were there to watch a troupe of funambulists. The high wire for their act was strung between 2 masts, each topped by a flimsy crow's nest, and glistened tautly above 60 feet of netless space. When we arrived, the decision had just been made that the sodden ground would, after all, provide adequate purchase for the guy ropes of this dizzy edifice, and one of the troupe was anxiously trying to drive the packs further into the gravel. I would have cravenly retreated had not the proprietress of our favourite Café de la Paix pointed eagerly to the table she had reserved for us. Every table outside the Hotel de Touristes and the other 2 cafes was already taken, so I had to pretend that nothing pleased me more than being ushered to a vantage point where I could not avoid seeing every detail of an accident, even if an unlucky acrobat did not actually land in my lap. A gramophone was blaring through a loudspeaker on the top of a small green van. It broke off and a voice announced that the death-defying performance of Mario Valesco and his troupe, which we were about to witness, would take place 18 meters above the ground without a net. Without a net was thrice repeated. The first turn was not too alarming, for the blond young man, carrying a long flexible pole, the balancier, negotiated the wire without apparent difficulty, and when the crowd displayed not the slightest interest, did it again rather faster. Applause still came from only about a dozen pair of hands in the crowd, who were standing 6 deep on the far side of the square. I began to feel a little more cheerful, thinking that if this performance was as dangerous as it looked, well, they would not be so apathetic. Their apparent apathy, in fact, was a studied rebuke to the town councillors, who had made the unpopular decision that there should be a collection for the troops in Algeria instead of the usual QUATORZE JUILLET celebration, a dance with unlimited free wine. The voice now announced that Mario, the world-famous, the most daring, the greatest funambulist, would now appear in person. Mario was a small man with a thin brown face and a body as tough and flexible as juniper wood. He nodded to the crowd as though he did so only because it would be discourteous to ignore them. Using the balancier, he did the double trip across the wire with elegance. Then, after the voice had pointed out how difficult this was, crossed it again with only his outstretched arms to steady him. Without bothering to acknowledge the splatter of applause, he slid down the rope and beckoned imperiously to one of the blond boys, who came forward carrying a heavy padded coat. After Mario had put this on, a rucksack was strapped on his back, which held, like cartridges in a bandolier, a row of large rockets. The voice now sounded that we were to have an estimable privilege of being the first audience in the world to see a man become a feu d'artifice 18 meters above the ground. Feu d'artifice. The first and the last, muttered Charles succinctly. For when they go off, they'll blow him off the wire. Under the weight of the rucksack, Mario climbed the rope ladder slowly, almost clumsily. The blond boy shinned up the rope and waved to the crowd, whose interest was at last apparent. The lights were switched off. Twice the fuse was lit, only to fizzle out. The audience was now so quiet that I could hear the third match scratch on the box. Now the fuse was throwing up a spray of sparks. Suspense heightened as Mario stepped onto the wire, dark against the sky as a great hawk holding a straw in its talons. With his balancier weaving in a dangerous wide arc, he moved slowly forward. With a hiss like a cobra, the first rocket went off, then another, then three together. On he went, slowly and placidly. Jewels of fire wove a headdress for him, and showers of golden rain his wings, as though a son of Lucifer were crossing the abyss between hell and heaven. That is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, said Charles. It lacked only the music of Stravinsky's Firebird. With Mario safely back on the ground, I thought the suspense was over. The lights came on again. As Mario went towards the loudspeaker van, I saw that he was limping. Suddenly, I felt a stab of sciatica down my left leg and knew that it was his pain I was feeling and not merely a flare-up of my own. The gramophone was now rendering the Ave Maria, the only alternative record to a march by a brass band. The melancholy theme broke off in mid-bar, and a voice boomed, "Attention, mesdames et messieurs," and declared that Mario had offered to cross the wire carrying any young lady from the audience on his back. Being convinced that no one could be foolhardy enough to volunteer, I was startled when a girl, wearing a white shirt and tight black torso trousers, ran into the circle of the arc lights and threw kisses to the audience. A few of them clapped, but these were mostly children who were perched on the statue of a stern gentleman in a cocked hat. She skipped lightly to the rope ladder, but let it swing away from her when she started to climb. "She is certainly not much of an acrobat," said Charles, "or is this incompetence only part of the act?" Was her nervousness part of the act too? Surely she would not let him carry her if she knew he was lame with sciatica. Or had I imagined his sciatica when all he had really been suffering from was a stone in the shoe? I watched intently as he climbed up after her, and knew that he was driving himself to defy an unfamiliar enemy, acute and almost crippling pain. For a moment they stood together in the crow's nest, the girl pleading, Mario becoming at first increasingly tense and then openly angry. "Not a suitable moment for a row," commented Charles, and the crowd, sensing that something was wrong, became more enthusiastic. The girl was by now either so frightened or so clumsy that she nearly throttled Mario when he tried to scramble onto his back, and sweat was streaming down their faces when she tried to scramble onto his back, and sweat was steaming down their faces before he got her securely in position. By the time he had at last began to inch forward along the wire, I was praying for them even harder than I had prayed for a matador being gorged in the Barcelona bullring. He kept fairly steady until he got more than halfway. Then his balancier started to flare the air. The crowd's indrawn breath sounded like waves sucking at shingle as Mario regained his balance and gained the other crow's nest in a tottering run. Applause was loud but brief, for a display of fireworks had already started in the riverside gardens. In a moment the crowd was streaming on its way to watch them, and the square was empty, save for the forlorn funambulists. Something had to be done to cheer them, so by the time Charles had ordered champagne, they were sitting round our cafe table. Conversation depended more on mime and intuition than on words, for Mario and the blonde boy came from Catalonia, and the other two men were Czechs. While Mario, after a detailed exchange of symptoms and sympathy with me, listened to a more erudite exposition on sciatica by Charles, I talked with a girl. She was French and spoke freely, having, I am still not quite sure why, understood me to say that I had recently retired from a circus, in which I had had a lion-taming act. She was a native of Toulouse, where she had been a member of the corps de ballet, had a charming illegitimate baby, sex and father unspecified, which was being looked after by her mother. She was 21 years old and considered that nothing at all interesting had happened in her life, until the wonderful, stupendous event of meeting Mario, with whom she had fallen instantly, passionately, and forever in love 10 days ago. So of course I had to join the act, she added, as though nothing could be more obvious. She was deeply concerned about Mario's pain. He is so ashamed of being in pain and so angry when I talk about it. Because I talked about it so much and tried to stop him appearing tonight, he thought I was accusing him of being afraid, which was why he insisted on working without a net. It is very frightening to work without a net. She sighed deeply. All night he does not sleep. He groans, he twitches. It's a torture to watch him. She lowered her voice. So dreadful is his pain that for the last 3 days he cannot even make love. Have you perhaps some medicine? I was not sure whether she meant an anodyne or an aphrodisiac, but having a supply of the first commodity, I was about to fetch some from the hotel when Charles guessed my intention and said, Mario has just told me that he has been getting injections of morphia from various quacks. I have told him that tomorrow he must see a proper medical practitioner. It is far too serious for optimistic amateurs to handle. I knew that the last remark was a firm hint to me, so I could do nothing more helpful than arrange to meet them the next morning and help them to find a doctor. For this assignation I dressed with some care, feeling that the medical profession would be more likely to take trouble about my protégés if I assumed the role of English country gentlewoman, rather than that of an out-of-work performer with the great cats. But I had forgotten that this was a French Sunday. I went to the home of every doctor in town, and all of them were taking Sunday off. I visited Saint-Cyr's splendid dentist, Monsieur Pureau, who had made Charles an excellent gold tooth, but he too had gone away for the day. I rang up 2 thermal establishments which treated rheumatism and so might have taken interest in a sufferer from sciatica, but without any useful result. Subdued, I went to report my failure. Mario was sitting on a hamper with his head in his hands. Before I could speak to him, I was intercepted by an old lady in black, who last night had been taking round the collection box. She introduced herself as Mario's mother, apologized bleakly for her son's ill manners, which had prevented him inviting her to join my party, and then launched into a tirade against the girl who had bewitched him at Toulouse. The girl who was entirely responsible for his sciatica, the girl who had thrust herself upon his family, and who was so arrogant that she thought that with a snap of the fingers he could become worthy of the world-famous funambulist, and could make him disobey his mother and refuse to enter hospital. At last she had to pause for breath, and I had a chance to say that it was natural and healthy for sons to disobey their mother. That many English mothers also found it painful when their sons grew up, but she interrupted. Madame, we Catalonians are wiser than you are. We know how to protect our sons. Her eyes were as obscurely wise as the eyes of an ancient tortoise. Early this morning I telephoned to Toulouse to engage the services of a funambulist who is only a little less famous than is my Mario. He demanded a disgracefully high salary, but I have my private savings. Mario will have to agree to go into hospital now, that the act can continue without him. The girl says she will visit him daily, but as you will soon see for yourself, madame, the girl will stay with the act and give my son time to forget she ever existed. But why should she leave him? I said indignantly. The tortoise lifted her wrinkled eyelids to loose at me a stare of profound disdain. Look behind you and learn the wisdom of a mother. Reluctantly I obeyed. Getting out of a car was a magnificent hunk of a man. The girl was gazing at him as he pulled off his shirt and luxuriantly flexed his muscles, gazing at the bronzed shoulders on which, above cheering crowds, she would safely ride. She glanced at Mario and I heard her say, My darling, I insist that you go today into hospital. Your mother and I together will look after the act. This was the end of chapter 8. Did I say today is the 17th of October 24, and the next chapter is chapter 9, Chateau and Châteauland.